is Martin Atkin. I'm one of the tutors on course for the Tangerine. But welcome to everybody, whether you're from my group or from the just hope that you can hear me. I'm just going to try and sort that out. Bear with me. Okay, hopefully this will now be okay. Sorry about, it appears that I've got some connection problems at my end, which is odd considering that I'm in the UK. But anyway, we'll hope that it works okay. Yes, so just to let you know, so a little bit of housekeeping for the webinar. If you want to ask a question, you can type it in the chat box at the bottom there, and I will, on the bottom left-hand side, and I will try and answer those either as we go along or towards the end. But can I ask you not, if somebody asks a question, don't try and, somebody else from the chat, don't try and answer it because otherwise it gets really confusing. Okay, so I'll try and get around to answering as many of those questions as possible. The other thing that you can do is if you look in the box, the attendee list, you'll see a little smiley face. And if you click on that, you get some options which allow you to raise the hand, agree, disagree, and so on. So let's all try that now just to see if it's working. So you can raise your hand like that. Yep, great. Okay, that's good. And but if please, once you've raised your hand or if you've agreed or disagreed or whatever, please clear my status. So go to the bottom of the box there, the drop-down box, and clear your status. Otherwise, it gets a bit confusing. Right. So the webinar today is scheduled to run for about 90 minutes, but we may not need that much time. But I'm going to crack on now. First of all, the first thing I wanted to say is that I'm not here to tell you how to do your jobs. Okay, some of you are very experienced journalists, and you know exactly what you're doing and how to tell a story for news. But there's we have a saying in English, which is teaching grandmother to suck eggs, which is a bit of a strange expression, but what it means is giving advice to somebody about a subject which they already know, and maybe even more than the person. So in other words, if you're an experienced journalist, a lot of what you're going to hear today, you will already know, but I still think it does no harm kind of to emphasize some of these things again. And uh, I think, if we want to tell stories which engage people, which interest people, which reach a wide audience, then there are a few kind of basic journalism 101s that it's worth bearing in mind. There's if you want to look up the full definition, there's the URL. The other thing I wanted to say is that we're talking about mainly about text journalism here, but I'm a television news journalist by background, and I still work as a documentary filmmaker and a film and video producer and director. And so, a lot of what I'm going to say is equally applicable to video, or indeed radio, actually, if you work in radio, uh, about storytelling and about the need for strong narratives and strong characters and stuff like that. And, we all know the expression that a picture paints 1,000 words. Well, I saw a statistics recently that 1 minute of video is worth 1.8 million words. That's from a research company called Forrester.com. Now, I'm not sure how they came up with that figure, but the point is that very often it's can tell stories, tell kind of complex stories about development issues, about minority rights issues, about human rights issues. We can tell them in a very accessible way and very succinctly and very easily accessible using visual storytelling, multimedia storytelling. And these days, most of us who are journalists work in a multimedia way. So we use photos, videos, infographics, animation, all sorts of different visual tools. And so just bear in mind that when we're talking about this course, we're not just talking about text, we're talking about all sorts of different media. So what makes a good story? I mean, it's a very kind of wide-ranging question, but I always like to quote when I was working for Greenpeace a few years ago and I was trying to sell stories to the news agencies. A Reuters television commissioner told me, "Tell me something I haven't heard before, show me something I haven't seen before, take me somewhere I haven't been before." And I think if you can do at least one of those things, maybe two or even three of them, but if you can do at least one of those things, then you are a long way towards telling a story which is going to engage, interest your audience. Because a lot of the issues that we're dealing with when we talk about human rights and minority rights and so on are quite complex, they're quite challenging, they're quite difficult for most people to kind of be interested in. So it's our job as journalists to make them as interesting as possible. And so this is a kind of a good rule of thumb to keep in mind about, finding a new angle, finding new characters to tell the story, finding new places to tell the story. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling. Of course, most of them are not particularly relevant for us because it's about fiction writing. Pixar, very successful feature film productions. But there are two of them which I think, are quite useful for us to bear in mind when we're talking about journalism and about factual storytelling. Um, And the first one is you've got to keep in mind what's interesting to your audience, not what you want to do as a writer. And they can be very different things. And what that means is that sometimes, as reporters, sometimes as journalists, we have an idea for a story or for a report that we want to do, which we feel is really important. Maybe it's something we've been thinking about for a long time. Maybe it's a subject a particular interest in, or that we're even, passionately wanting to tell. But we don't necessarily. It doesn't follow that our audience is as interested or as passionate as we are. So sometimes you have to kind of take a bit of a step back and say, okay, is this story really going to interest my audience, or do I need to find a different angle, or do I need to find some different characters, or a different way of telling the story? Because what interests me doesn't necessarily interest my audience. And very often when we find, that our editor has said no, that's not what we want to publish, or if your commissioning editor is saying no, I'm not interested in that. If you kind of if you get told no often enough, you have to ask yourself, well, am I going about this the right way? So just it's about bearing in mind that just because we're interested in the story doesn't mean that everybody else is. And in order to get them interested, we have to find interesting ways of telling the story. And the last of Pixar's 22 rules of storytelling is, what's the essence of your story? What's the most economical way of telling it? If you know that, you can build out from there. What that means is, and this is particularly applicable to news journalism, where we have very little space, very little time to write our stories or to tell our stories. It has to be done really quickly and succinctly. Is that we have to identify what is the essence, what is the most important point that you're trying to say, what is the angle of the story that you really want to get across, and how can I say that in the shortest, most engaging way, without, of course, losing the sense of what you want to say. So I'm not talking about dumbing down here to the or oversimplifying, but what I'm saying is, once you've found your story, what is the most interesting part of the story, and then start with that and build out from there. So this is the kind of classic um, way of telling news stories: to start with the most interesting point and to build out from there. Don't don't try and cram too much stuff in there. Don't try and cram too much detail into your story. Uh, don't try and tell more than one story at a time, and this is frequently a danger that we fall into, is that we don't kind of just keep focused on one story. And what is the shortest, simplest, and most accessible way that I can tell that story? And we'll come on later on in the webinar to go into that in a bit more detail. So, why do we tell stories? I mean, stories are the oldest form of human communication. If you think back to, even visual storytelling is one of the oldest forms of human communication. You think back to those, cave paintings that have been found in places like Spain and France, which date back, tens of thousands of years. These are actually ancient infographics, if you like. They are ancient visual ways of telling stories. So it is a very, very old form of human communication. It's also common to all human cultures. Storytelling is the one cultural activity which every single uh, nation, every single ethnic group, every single culture on the planet shares. We love to tell each other stories. We love to hear stories from each other. We tell stories because it helps us make sense of the world around us. And this is particularly applicable to what we're talking about during the minority realities in the news course, because we can use storytelling to make sense of some very complex and challenging and difficult issues, especially for audiences who aren't particularly interested in them. So uh, we can distill complex information, complex reports, complex data into stories, which then help us to interpret and make sense of the world that's around us. They also, as I say, they enable us to share complex information easily and quickly. Um, and as journalists and as people who care about the issues that we're writing about, it enables us to raise awareness because we care about them. I mean, after all, in a sense, I feel that, there's no point in writing about issues like minority rights, like human rights, development, these immigration, these kinds of issues, if we don't really care about them, because that will be reflected in our writing. It'll come across as being kind of a bit flat and a bit boring, frankly. So a degree of interest, a degree of passion is very good. But, and we'll talk about this a bit later on, we mustn't let that passion and that interest and that caring get in the way of our journalism. And, it's very easy to stray over the line into editorializing, campaigning, and so on. I mean, there is a place for campaigning journalism. Of course, there is. And campaigning journalism has a very long and honorable tradition. But that's not what we're about in this particular course. What we're about is reporting minority rights stories. And we'll go into the problems associated with editorializing and bias later on in the webinar. Now, the other thing that we need to bear in mind is, of course, the importance of our audience, because we don't tell stories in a vacuum. We tell them to somebody, or we show them to somebody. And because most of us who are either journalists or filmmakers, storytellers of one sort or another, want to have our stories heard, then, it's not enough just to write something. We want people to read it. Otherwise, what's the point? So, knowing who your audience is, knowing the kind of language, the kind of format, the kind of medium, the platforms, the channels that they are comfortable with and that they are most likely to engage with is really important. So you wouldn't write the same story in the same way for a tabloid newspaper as you would for a 60-minute documentary, for example. You have to tailor the way you tell your stories according to who you're talking to. And you have to know how to reach them as well. Now, most of us, or most of you, I'm sorry, I think, work for publications of one sort or another. It might be online, it might be print, it might be TV or radio channels. So you already have an audience. Those of us who are freelancers have to find an audience, and that's kind of a bit of a different question. And later on in the course, we'll be having webinars on freelance journalists who work in this field with lots of really great tips about how to find your audience and how to get your stories published. But so in terms of audience, as I said, the stories don't exist in a vacuum. It's a two-way process. We create the stories, but somebody has to read them or listen to them or watch them. There's no point doing it, I don't think. What is the point of being a journalist if nobody's reading, watching, or listening to your material? So knowing who your audience is really important, and especially with complex issues like human rights, minority rights, we can get a bit bogged down in the detail and we can forget about our audiences. And again, I emphasize what we're talking about here on this course is reaching a broad public media audience who don't necessarily have a good understanding of these quite complex issues. And therefore, we have to understand that when we're writing them or when we're telling those stories, that we have to do it in such a way that they're easily understandable. Otherwise, nobody's going to read them. Nobody's going to engage with them. That doesn't mean, as I said just now, it doesn't mean you must dumb down. But there's a difference between dumbing down and being accessible. And you have to ask yourself, who do I want to read or watch or listen to my story? Who am I trying to reach? What sort of audience is that? And then that will inform the way you construct your story. How am I going to reach them, engage them? Well, that might be through your existing publications. So if you work for a newspaper or for an online site or whatever, that's fine. You already have an audience. If you're a freelance, you've got to work out ways of reaching audiences You've got to find the right channels and the right platforms. You've got to go. When I worked for an organization called Green TV a few years ago, we had this saying that you go fishing where the fish are. So you can't expect your audience to come to you. You have to go looking for your audience. So you have to make things as easy as possible for your audience. Again, we live in an age where audiences have huge choice about which news they choose to read, which sites they choose to go on. And if they're not very quickly engaged, then they will go elsewhere. They'll either turn the page of the newspaper, or they will switch to another TV channel, or they'll click on another link. So you mustn't assume that your audience are interested or care about what you're writing about. That's the first thing. You have to create that interest and that level of caring. Don't assume that they have any prior knowledge, especially if we're specialist correspondents. If we work in a particular area, it's quite easy to forget that our audience may not know as much about the subject as we do. So you should always, don't assume a certain level of awareness or knowledge, and always remember to give the context for the story that you're writing about. And don't assume that they haven't got anything better to do. I mean, frankly, why should they read our stories or watch our TV reports when there are 101, 1,001 other things that they should do? We don't have a God-given right to be heard. We have to earn that right by creating stories which are accessible, engaging, and relevant. And the reason I put that in quotation marks there is because I thought you might think that it was from somebody, somebody famous or something, but actually I made that up myself. But I really feel, very very strongly about this, that a lot of journalists and a lot of publications assume that people are going to read them or watch them or listen to them, but they're not. You have to earn that right. Okay, I'm just going to pause there for a second. So a few quick reporting guidelines. And as I said right at the beginning, a lot of these will be familiar to you if you've either studied journalism or if you've been working as a journalist for some time. But I think it's kind of worth repeating, even for those of us who've worked in this business for a long time. Grab them and keep them. I mean, I referred to this earlier, but it's so important. I cannot emphasize it enough that the first few seconds of your report, the first few lines of your article are what will make or break, whether your audience sticks with you or not. So you've got to make it really interesting. You've got to summarize the most interesting part of the story in the first few seconds or sentences, and stick that right up the top. Don't bury it away. There was a famous, well, there still is a Sunday newspaper in the UK called the Sunday Express. And years ago, when I was a newspaper reporter, I used to work for them occasionally. And they have this famous technique which they've used for years. I mean, like over 50 years, called the drop intro, where you have to read about 5 or 6 paragraphs before they tell you what the point of the story is. I mean, it's a kind of a style of theirs, and I suppose it must work because they're still in business. But it's an incredibly old-fashioned way of writing. These days, with, as I said, with very short attention spans, with plenty of other distractions, you've got to grab your audience straight away and keep them. Make them want to read on. Make them want to keep listening. Make them want to keep watching. Less is more. So this is, again, if you work in television news like I did for a long time, you have to learn to tell your story very, very quickly. I mean, attention spans are very short these days. We're talking about writing for news. I mean, of course, what I'm saying here doesn't necessarily apply to comment pieces, analysis pieces, long form journalism, all of which is absolutely great, no problem. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is mainstream news journalism. So less is more. That means that you have to keep your story to the absolute bare essentials to let it be understood and to tell the story. So keep it as short as possible. Take out everything which isn't necessary, and then go back and do it again. And this is a really good tip, especially if you're working in film or television, is that in the edit, take out everything that's not necessary, then watch it again and take out everything that's not necessary, because as sure as hell, the first time round, you won't have taken everything out. Make sure that your interviewees or your quotes don't repeat each other. So your every quote, every point you make should add something to the story. It shouldn't repeat a point that was previously made. Otherwise, what's the point? Okay, keep it simple, stupid. This is a kind of, so it's KISS. It's an easy way to remember. Write clearly and simply with a direct narrative structure. And that doesn't matter if you're writing for print or writing for online or writing a script for a radio report or a TV report. Write it simply and with a direct narrative structure, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Don't assume that your readers know the backstory. So give the context. So you have to give some context in order to give understanding, but you don't need to go into every single detail. As people like stories about people, and this is something that particularly applies to when we're talking about the assignments for this course, which will come on in a minute. In a few minutes, we'll talk about the first assignment. But I think as a general rule of people like stories about people. And what that means is that when we're talking about complex issues, minority rights, human rights, development, international relations, immigration, these kinds of complex issues, which most people have only a very limited understanding of and a limited interest in, then one way into engaging people and interesting them is to use human stories as an entry point. So you can find, examples, case studies of people which illustrate your story, illustrate the point that you're making, and let them tell their story. Let them act as the entry point into the story. And you can get into the more sort of detail later, because once you've got people hooked, then hopefully they will stick with you to the end. But you have to grab them first of all. As I said, grab them and keep them. And one good way of doing that is to tell human stories, because we all, as humans, we have a natural empathy with most of us do anyway, have a natural empathy with our fellow human beings. So we like to hear stories about other people. We can relate to them more easily. And they don't have to be people like us, but it's a good way of getting an entry point into these kind of quite difficult issues. And tell stories, not issues. I mean, this is actually something that applies not so much to journalists, I think, because most of us as journalists know what makes a good story. But a lot of people who work, for example, for NGOs or for think tanks or for or even for corporations or for activist organizations who are, maybe they work in the communications team or on the media team or something like that, confuse. So, for example, campaigning journalists and journalists who are embedded with NGOs, campaigns, issues, testimonies, injustices, these are not stories in themselves, They become stories when you create a compelling narrative about them and when you find strong characters to tell the story. But so, it's not our job as journalists to report issues, it's our job to report stories which tell, which illustrate the issue and which act as an entry point into the issue. Okay. Show don't tell is I mean, again, this kind of applies to more and more now that we work in a multimedia world. So whether you're a television journalist or a documentary filmmaker, or you're simply a journalist that uses photos or information, infographics, these kind of things, then let the pictures tell the story. It's very often a much quicker and a much easier and more accessible way of engaging your audience and of getting complex information across very quickly. Now, don't editorialize. And again, as journalists, this is something that we kind of think that we all understand, but all of us fall into this trap every now and again. And by editorializing, I mean letting our own opinions and judgments creep into our reporting. Because again, I emphasize we're talking about news reporting here. We're not talking about comment. We're not talking about op-eds, so opinion editorials. We're not talking about blogs, which are a different form of journalism, a perfectly valid one, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about news reporting. And it's really important that we don't allow our own judgment and our own opinions and our own bias, which we all have, of course, to creep into our reporting. And the reason for that is because as soon as our audience suspects that they're not being told the whole truth, or they suspect that they're only being told one side of the story, or they suspect that they're not seeing facts, they're seeing opinion, then the credibility, the authority of the story is undermined. Okay, so it's really, I believe it's very important. And, I trained at the BBC as a director and as a journalist, so maybe I have a bit of an old-fashioned view about this. And I do understand that in some countries the culture is different and that a certain amount of editorializing is not only allowed but expected. But I think if we want to talk to a global audience in an increasingly globalized media age, then there are certain journalistic standards, certain norms which we should adhere to. Otherwise, we shouldn't be surprised if we get attacked or if we only get small audiences because people don't trust what we're saying. Now, of course, we can all point to examples of media which is incredibly biased. Here in the UK, we have a very right-wing media on the whole, especially the print media, and it's horrendously biased. But the point is that everybody knows it, so it's kind of like, what's the point? It's like it's like playing a game. Everyone knows that they're biased. Everyone knows that they have an agenda, so nobody believes them. So I think that is really, really important that we don't take sides, we don't make judgments or comments. And this doesn't mean you have to be bland or boring or slavishly report both sides of the story, because sometimes that's difficult and sometimes it's not necessary. But your stories will carry far more weight if your audience believes that you are objective and that you're not taking sides. I mean, just think of Fox News in the States, for example. Nobody takes them seriously because everyone knows that they have an agenda to push. So this is keeping it balanced is, of course, related to editorializing. And I mean, one of the examples that I use here quite often is that, I mean, for a long time, I've been working in the field of environmental journalism and climate change in particular. And even nowadays, when 98% of the world's scientists agree that climate change is real and that it's caused by by human activity, there are still some TV channels, some newspapers that insist on, whenever there's a debate about climate change, insist on bringing out the climate change skeptics, even though they're a tiny, tiny minority. And they're completely, their credibility has been totally undermined. So this doesn't mean that every time you write a story, you have to include the opposite viewpoint, however crazy it is, or however um, uh, undermined it has been. But it does mean that you have to keep in the back of your mind that as journalists, we have a duty to report in as fair and unbiased and balanced way as possible. Attribute, attribute, attribute. This, again, when we come to the assignments, this is something that is really important. So it's what I'm talking about here is that whenever you cite a fact or an opinion or a quote or a report or any part of your story, you must make it clear that it's not you as the writer or the journalist that is saying this. You're reporting to somebody else or another organization. So use phrases like, when you're talking about claims and data and statistics and quotes, use phrases such as according to, or research by, or a recent report from. And that makes it clear that it's not you that's saying it, you're simply reporting what somebody else is saying. So this is really important, because if you don't attribute data and statistics and quotes and opinions and so on, people will think they'll think two things. They'll wonder where the hell this stuff has come from. So, what's the source of this information? And they'll think that maybe you've just made it up, frankly. So it's really important to cite and to attribute. And finally, I mean, this applies to a lot of things in life, but it particularly applies to when you're preparing to write an article. Remember the 7 Ps, which only works in English, of course, I've just realized, but nonetheless, there might be an equivalent in your language. Perfect preparation and planning prevent pathetically poor performance. Actually, the person who told me this, who was a Royal Marines, so an army instructor, used a different word for pathetically, but we won't go into that right now. I'll leave you to imagine for yourself what that was. Okay, hang on. I'm just going to pause there for a second, and because I've been talking for a long time. Does anybody have any questions at this stage? If you do, don't forget to type them into the chat box, and I'll attempt to answer them. This isn't beer, by the way. I wish it was. That comes later. Okay. Now, it might seem that, these the advice I've been giving you is kind of a bit designed to make you report like a robot, and not to have an opinion, not to be passionate about your storytelling. But that is absolutely not what I mean. So I'm going to play a little video clip in a minute by a reporter. Oh, well, he's more than a reporter. He's quite a famous television presenter now in the UK, who called Jon Snow, who recorded a piece when he came back after reporting from the conflict in Gaza last year, which I think is a really powerful piece of journalism, and it is actually very opinionated. And he got into a lot of trouble for it, actually, or at least he got a lot of criticism for it, because he was staying away from impartial journalism in a way. But I think when you see this, and I'm going to play it in a minute, you'll see why it's so effective. I'm going to attempt to do this. Just hang on 1 second. Sorry about this. I'm just trying to find the. Here we go. The link, so I can put that into the. So here we go. Right. Um,
I'm back, and in the comfort of this studio, it's hard to imagine I was ever away. I don't need to imagine, though, because what I saw is still etched in my mind. What I never knew is what I know now, which is that those people who live in Gaza are mainly, but unbelievably young. The average age is 17. That means that about 250,000 are under 10. And you know, if you know any 10-year-olds, 7-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 4-year-olds, the idea in the looseness of a war zone that you can control your children, that they won't be somewhere where they can be hit, is, you know, beyond any kind of imagination. You can't hope to control that. So that in a very densely packed urban area, if you decide to throw missiles, shells, and the rest, then undoubtedly you will kill children. And that is what they're doing. There was one specific moment that stood out above all others, and that was penetrating the 3rd floor of the Shiva Hospital, one of 2 floors dedicated to children. That's where I met Maha, terribly crippled by shrapnel that had penetrated her spine. That's where I saw this little 2.5-year-old with panda-sized, huge, suppurating, round, panda-like wounds that almost prevented her eyes opening at all. They were the consequence of a broken skull and a fractured nose. I can't get those images out of my mind. I don't think you can either, because they've been everywhere. They are the essence of what is happening in Gaza. Now, of course, Hamas, for its part, was throwing rockets into Israel, designed, ideally, as they would put it, to kill Israelis. But of course, Israel, courtesy of American finance, has invented the most brilliant shield, which is keeping absolutely everything out. And that's a big difference. The suffering is amongst the ground troops, mainly 20-year-olds, who go in and get killed. So when I last spoke to the Norwegian doctor who is one of those dealing with the consequences of this bombing, I asked him how many children have been wounded. They've registered 1,310. How many children dead? 166. But that number is growing all the time. That is what makes this something that every one of us has to confront. We have to know that in some way we actually share some responsibility for those deaths, because for us it is no priority whatever to stop it. Our United Nations, our government, our world is not that interested. The fact that you're watching this, that you've chosen to watch it, means that you're actually motivated to do something. And that, in the end, is the greatest hope the people in Gaza have. We cannot let it go on. If our reporting is worth anything, if your preparedness to listen and watch and read is anything to go by, together we can make a difference.
So I think that's a great example of passionate reporting, which nonetheless retains the integrity and retains the uh, retains a journalistic rigor. Okay, so for me, he didn't cross the line into um, over editorializing. Let's put it that way. Okay, hang on just a minute. Uh, Yeah, so just to go back to that, the last thing Jon Snow said there is, if our reporting is worth anything, if your preparedness to listen, to watch, and read is anything to go by, together we can make a difference. And for me, that's the kind of the essence of good journalism, is that it stirs a reaction in the audience, who then want to go on and find out more about the subject, or to get involved in the issue, or whatever it happens to be. So all the rules, all the guidelines that I've been talking about not editorializing, attributing, not being balanced, all these things, that doesn't mean that you have to be completely dispassionate, and you don't have to be completely robotic about your journalism. Far from it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the assignments. Actually, before I do that, sorry, I've got a question here that Anna has asked, and she asks, "Is there a strategy to keep it brief and provide a basic intro uh, about the history or geography, etc., of a topic, when you are talking about a more obscure country or an ethnic uh, uh, group or something like that?" So, yeah, when the audience is very unfamiliar with what you're talking about, I mean, of course, you have to explain the context of the story, because, like I said earlier on, you can't assume a degree of knowledge on the part of your audience. What I'm saying is that the kind of the detail and the context, and the kind of maybe the data or the statistics about any given story, or that are relevant to any given story, don't start with that. Start with the most interesting fact. Keep it short, keep it simple. And then once you've grabbed the attention of your audience, once you've got their attention and they want to read on, then you can give them a bit more information. Then you can give them a bit more context. So the first assignment, actually, that's a very good question, because it applies particularly to this first assignment, which you will be working on later this week. You may already have started working on it. The first assignment is all about taking some fairly dense data about development policy in your own country, um, and to think about how to communicate the issues to a wider audience. So you've given some links on the assignment about where to find out the data for overseas development aid for your country, how much your country has contributed in ODA recently. All the statistics are there, and turn that into an interesting story. Now, of course, if you were to start off just by saying something like, to take a random example, um, in 2014, Greece contributed only 0.01% of its GDP to overseas development aid, and the figure is likely to be less this year. I mean, who the hell's interested in that? I mean, that's a really, it may be true. It is true. It's a really dull way of telling the story, So what you want to do is to find an engaging way of getting as an entry point. So, for instance, and I'm not suggesting, or I'm not saying that you have to do it this way, but on previous courses and previous assignments, a lot of participants have taken real life examples of how ODA is used. So that might be in to fund an educational program. It might be to fund a hospital or an environmental or a climate change adaptation program, and to talk about the people who are involved in that. So maybe you pick a teacher who is funded by ODA, or you pick a student who is benefiting from ODA, and you use that as your entry point into the story. So if you have a story which talks about uh, a doctor who's working in a field hospital in Sudan, saving lives, and you start with that, that's interesting. I want to read about this guy or woman. I want to find out what the challenges are that they face and why, lack of ODA means that they can't do their job properly. That's interesting. And then later in the story, you can get into the kind of the policy details, if you like. You can get into the statistics about and percentages and that kind of thing. But if you start with that, then very few people are going to be engaged by that and read on. Okay, so make it interesting for a wider news audience. Don't forget that your audience for these assignments is a broad news audience. It's not an audience that has specialist knowledge or has any interest, actually. Take the complex and turn it in the complex data and turn it into a compelling story. And there are a number. The example I just gave, that's just one approach. There might be many different approaches to find an entry point into the story. And I think this is the point about, once you've grabbed their attention, that's their entry point into the story. Then you can go into a bit more detail. You can give some text. You can give some background information. As I said, quote sources, attribute data, and don't editorialize. It's, I say this every course, and so does Brent to our students, but we still get a few, articles that are written in a very kind of personal and highly editorialized way. And I repeat, there may be a place for that. It might be a blog. It might be an opinion column in a newspaper. It might be an analysis piece. But that's not what we're about here. Okay, and I'm just going to quickly put up here on the screen. By the way, all these slides are online, so you can look at them at your leisure. Some useful resources that you might find give you some. There we go. They're all up there. You don't have to look at them now, particularly. So more questions. Julia asks, can you give an example of reporting that crossed line? Well, I mean, there's quite a famous one. I mean, I can think of lots of examples. And, journalists are human beings. They're like everybody else. And we all make mistakes sometimes. And we all allow our passion and our personal opinion to creep into our reporting sometimes. I mean, it's unavoidable. All I'm saying is that try not to, or be aware of it, at least be aware of it. But yes, I can. There was, a recent example I mentioned Fox News earlier. Fox News carried a report a couple of months ago during the start of we've just had a general election here in the UK. And a lot of the focus of the debate in the general election was about the Muslim population in the UK and Muslim extremist terrorism and the potential for terrorism and so on. And Fox News carried a report which claimed that the city of Birmingham, which is the second biggest city in the UK and is actually very near to where I live, and where I am right now, was large parts of it were no-go areas because it had been taken over by Muslim extremists, and that the white population were fleeing in terror. Well, I mean, of course, nothing could be further than the truth. It's just ludicrous. But Fox News have an agenda to push. They're very reactionary and right wing, and so they will report stories in such a way that suits their agenda. And that's just one kind of very blatant example. They're not always, of course, as blatant as that. I had a student on a previous course who wrote a story for her final assignment about the white minority in South Africa, the Afrikaner minority in South Africa, and about the hardships that they were now suffering. And they are, by many measures, they are now a vulnerable and persecuted minority in South Africa. And just because your feelings about how they behaved under the previous apartheid regime uh, doesn't, that's neither here nor there. The fact is, they are now suffering, and they are a minority in their own right. But as part of that report, and it was a really interesting story, actually, and she started off by telling the story of this couple who actually lived in a graveyard because they couldn't afford to live in a house. They lived in a sort of tomb in a graveyard. Um, but as part of that report, I think she crossed the line because she carried quotes and she carried statistics or claims from some very right-wing white supremacist organizations in South Africa, which, had she checked them out, she would have realized that these were unsubstantiated and unsubstantiable claims. So, what started out as a good story was kind of a little bit spoiled by crossing that line. I'm not sure if she had an agenda, but that's the way it came across. Okay. So let's see what other questions we have here. Sorry, I'm just trying to. What is your approach to hate speech towards minorities? Do you think we should quote and then analyze it when used by public figures, or just avoid publishing it? No, I don't think we should avoid publishing it, actually. I think very often by reporting, the more outrageous types of hate speech, we actually, expose these people for being what they are. I think, our audiences, by and large, are quite well attuned to these. They can spot bullshit and idiots when they see them. So I think it's our job as reporters to report what people are saying. Of course, you have to be careful when it comes to kind of actually reporting people who are inciting violence or inciting acts of terrorism or whatever. But yeah, no, I do think it's our job as reporters to report everybody's opinion, however unpleasant we may find it. It's not our job to make, to make judgments on what they're saying. We put the facts in front of our audiences and let them make up their minds. I can see that quite a number of people have joined very recently under the impression that the webinar started now, and I'm not sure why that is, but I'm sorry about that. What I would say is that the whole webinar is being recorded and will be available online, so you will be able to you'll be able to watch the whole thing. So I'm not quite sure why that has happened. A mix up over summer and winter time, maybe. Okay, somebody asks a question about assignment 1. Are we writing an actual article with sources? The website is just a proposal. Yeah, so assignment 1 requires you to write a very short article, only 500 words, and you're not. based on the statistics and the information that you will find in the links that are given in the question. You're not required to actually interview anybody for it, but you are asked to make a short list of the kind of people that you would interview or the sort of organizations that you would approach for a quote were you to be writing this for real. So, but what we are expecting is a proper news article, so fully rounded, but you don't actually have to do the interviews. Okay, I'm just trying to see if there are any other questions here that I haven't answered. Okay, so someone asks, how are we not to lose passion for our work when we are disappointed? That's that's a very good question, actually. It doesn't just apply to journalism, does it? Um, I mean, journalists, especially those of us, those reporters who work a lot in kind of conflict zones or in very difficult parts of the world or under challenging conditions, it's easy to become cynical and disappointed in the world around us. But I think when you hear from the two journalists who will be giving webinars later in the course, who hugely experienced in this, you'll see that they certainly haven't lost their kind of spark of passion for the stories that they're writing. I mean, I suppose, covering different sorts of stories, covering, finding new angles, finding fresh faces and fresh characters and fresh ways to tell the stories, even though they may. I mean, it goes back to the quote I used from Reuters earlier on. Most stories have been covered in one way or another. It's very hard to find a totally new story. Even breaking news stories, most of them are similar to ones that have happened before. So it's very difficult to find something completely new. The trick is to find new angles on stories that have been told before, or that similar stories have been told before. Um, and I think that's what if you can find a fresh angle and a kind of a fresh way or new people to tell those stories, new interviewees, new locations, then kind of keep your spark of enthusiasm alive. But it's like any job, it's difficult. Sometimes you get a bit disillusioned with it. Okay. How do we shorten the distance when we present a story from a place that's very unfamiliar to our audience? Um, I mean, I guess by that you mean, how do we put people in that place? I mean, I think good writing, good storytelling, at its best, and does transport us to wherever we are. I mean, that's obviously slightly easier with visual storytelling. So use of video clips, use of photos are a good way of kind of putting your audience on the spot, on the location. Um, but there are some great examples of travel journalism, for instance, which really just take you right there. You can, just the power of the language. So I think it's a question of just using using all the resources that you can to make your audience feel as though they're actually part of the story. And like I said earlier, people like stories about people. I mean, that's one way of creating a kind of a direct connection very straight away. I may never have met the guy who is a downtrodden farmer in Mexico or a member of a vulnerable minority in Cambodia. I may never have met that person, but if I can empathize with him or her as a human being, then that instantly creates a connection. It creates a bond, which helps to overcome that feeling of distance and and it being kind of a long way away and it's not really my problem and why should I worry? Well, I should worry, I should care because this is a fellow human being, so if we can create that human connection, I think that's one way of doing it. Okay, how are we doing for questions? Somebody's typing. Okay, here we go. So it's a bit difficult to. How many sources should a good story have? How can we verify them? Um, well, I mean, there's no set answer to that. I mean, how many sources should a story have? I mean, funnily enough, the BBC. I was listening to someone a senior executive from the BBC talking the other day. They always try and have at least two sources. Well, no, in fact, they have a rule. It's not try. They have a rule that they must have two independent sources to verify a story before reporting on it. Um, so, but that's more to do with checking that the facts, checking that something has actually happened. So, for example, if there's a plane crash, they won't report it until two completely independent sources have said there's been a plane crash in this place and so on. So, but in terms of the number of sources to stand a story up, I mean, there is no set number. I mean, you may only have one source to stand a story up if they're an authoritative source. Sorry, if they're an authoritative source and if they're credible and they can back up what they're saying. But there's no hard and fast rule about that. I mean, generally, you want to present a number of different viewpoints if you possibly can, simply in order to add credibility to your story. If you've got three or four people who are all saying the same thing but in different ways, then that's fine. Is it possible the story says it all without statistics and without quoting serious sources? Well, yes, of course it's possible, but then you're really getting into the realm, I think, of blogging and comment. So, if you write a blog, which is very personal, say, you can say whatever you like without having to stand it up or without having to cite or attribute facts and figures. But you have to understand that that will come across as your personal opinion. And that's fine. Maybe that's what you want. But it's not news reporting for me. Okay, what do we got here? Brent. Hi, Brent. How do all the different platforms, kinds of media influence journalistic storytelling in your experience, and the trend towards micro content versus long form? Yeah, I mean, this is really interesting because actually, I've seen I mean, because I work in video mainly these days and filmmaking, I've seen quite a change actually because from when, like, say, 10 years ago, when the received wisdom that you had to be that your video must be no longer than about sort of 2.5, 3 minutes long, otherwise people lose interest and all the rest of it, has changed a lot. Partly because the kind of online viewing experience is much better now. So people have tablets which with much better resolution. They have laptops, they have mobiles, and so on with much better resolution to them. So watching films, watching video online is a much more kind of pleasurable experience, and that means that people are starting to watch for longer now. So long form content is kind of making a bit of a comeback online. The great thing about online storytelling, especially online visual storytelling, is that you can divide your, you can edit your video up into little chunks, and you can do it for written stories as well, of course, into bite-sized chunks, so people don't have to watch it all or read it all at the same time. Whereas, if you're watching a television program, then you have to sit through the whole half hour unless you've recorded it and come back to it later. But the point I'm making is that so very often these days, documentary filmmakers will make one long version, but then they'll make many smaller versions or many shorter excerpts, so you can watch it as kind of like a mini series, if you like. And there's a trend towards web documentary storytelling, which is even better because that combines, all the, so you can have little video clips on there, you can have pop-up photographs, you can have infographics which you can interact with all in one place, and you can pick and choose which bits you want to interact with. So I think the trend is very much towards presenting bite-sized chunks of stories, if you like, but which, if your audience is really interested enough, they will put them all together and make a bigger story. I'm not sure if that answers your question or not, but I think that's certainly a trend that I'm seeing now, is that people are creating stories which can be received. It's the wrong word. Which can be read or watched in many different ways and in many different forms. And of course, loads of journalists are using Twitter now to tell stories. I mean, Twitter is a really come into its own as a form of breaking news. And again, the webinars we have later on in the course will go into that in more detail. But both for people who want to reach journalists and for journalists who want to be across as many different sources as possible, Twitter is it's perfect for that. Okay, good. Where do you draw the line between facts and giving an opinion? Because even the choice of facts could be subjective. Yes, I mean that is. Sorry, my earphone fell out. Yes, I mean it's a really good question, and I did say, look, none of us are perfect. All of us, we're all humans. So we will all, from time to time, we will allow our natural bias, our unconscious bias, our own opinions and our own judgments to creep into our reporting. It's natural, and it's not something that we should get too hung up about. But I suppose in kind of reporting terms, what I would say is that if you want to make a point and you can't attribute it, and attribute it either through a quote from another source or attribute it by referring to a report or a website or some source, if you can't do that, then it becomes your opinion. It's no longer well, it might be a fact, but we don't know it's a fact. And that's the point I was talking about earlier, is that your audience has to be able to trust you, that you are reporting as near to the truth, and truth is a subjective thing, of course, but as near to the truth, as near to the facts as they can reasonably expect. And if you don't attribute the point that you're making, then it comes as your opinion, not as an independently verifiable fact. And that, I would say, for me, that's kind of crossing the line between reporting and an opinion. Yeah. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if anybody else has any questions, okay, here we go. How can I, as a journalist, sell a story and raise awareness in the mainstream media about an issue that's going on in the global south, which is very far away? Yeah, well, it's difficult is the answer to that, and I suspect that's probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but it is incredibly difficult. Most most mainstream media in Western Europe, and by mainstream media I mean, the kind of popular daily newspapers, the 24-hour news channels, the big news websites, are cutting their budgets for foreign news coverage and rely mainly on the wire services. Then there's a perception, I think, that their audiences, their readers, are not terribly interested in foreign stories. Actually, I think that's a false perception because it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. If they don't cover foreign news stories, then their audiences don't get to engage with them, and therefore they come to expect that they're not going to be terribly interesting, or they're too far away to bother with. There are no guarantees, and actually, the two journalists we're going to hear from later on in the course have some really good tips on how to sell your stories into commissioning editors, and so on. So, but I think what you can do is to make your stories as interesting and as engaging as possible to the audience, to the target audience. So if you have got a particular publication in mind that you want to pitch your story to, make sure it's pitched in a way that the commissioning editor or the editor can say, oh yes, that's something that my audience would be interested in. So that's to do with kind of the language you use, the tone of voice, the approach, and so on has to be appropriate to the audience of that particular media outlet. So you can kind of do yourself a bit of a favor um, by making sure that you're reporting in a style that's appropriate to whoever you're pitching to. I mean, for instance, here in the UK, you would, if you were pitching to the Sun, which is the biggest popular tabloid newspaper in the country, you would pitch it in a very different style to if you were pitching it to the Times or the Guardian. So, and it may sound obvious, but people sometimes forget that. Um, but how do we engage audiences about stories that are from a long way away? I mean, it's tricky. It is tricky. I think telling human stories, telling human interest stories, using real life examples, case studies, um, trying to tell. Not always the sort of issues that we cover tend to be lend themselves to a rather kind of doom and gloom type of approach, but I'm not sure. There are some good positive stories as well. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I work a lot in the field of climate change. I mean, for the last 15 or 20 years, climate change stories have been relentlessly depressing. And then, we wonder why people don't want to read them or watch them. Well, because people don't like to be depressed, is the answer to that. People don't like to be told that it's their fault, and they don't like to be held to blame, for something that's happening on the other side of the world. So, I think we need to try and find positive ways of telling these stories, or more upbeat ways of telling these stories. Success stories. People like success stories. So find some examples of where overseas development aid has been a big success. Find some examples of where a minority group has really empowered themselves and has made a difference to their own lives. Or have managed to get a change in legislation or something like that. Mix it up a bit so it's not always gloom and doom stories. There's a bit of positivity in there as well. But I'm afraid that there is no hard and fast answer. What do you think the future holds for traditional news journalism? Might it be taken over by citizen journalism or a kind? Yes, I'm never quite sure about that phrase, citizen journalism, because for me it's a oxymoron. It's a contradiction in terms. Um, I mean, of course, there is a place for so-called citizen journalism. There's a place for user-generated content. And as everybody carries a smartphone in their pocket these days that can take photos, video, can be instantly tweeting a new breaking news story, that's fine. But I do think that there will always be a place, and there should always be a place for uh, serious, objective reportage, because otherwise, we don't know. We can't trust. How can we trust what people are saying? I mean, this is why, I work for NGOs and I work as a freelance journalist. Um, and sometimes it's hard to kind of swap my hats over, if you like. But the uh, what a lot of NGOs make the mistake of doing is telling stories which make which can't necessarily be verified, or at least need journalists to go back and verify them. So when organizations or individuals are acting as journalists in a way, or trying to act as journalists, it always sets a few alarm bells ringing for me. It's not to say there's not a place for it, but it has to be recognized, I think, that it's not, or and actually, if you look on this list of useful resources that I've put up here, the verification handbook is a really useful one, which deals a lot about how to verify so-called news reporting from citizen journalists. I think that's really worth having a look at. Okay. How I'm going to have to make this the last question, but how is it possible to draft an article with regards minorities who are affected by prejudices in order to spread the matters around them? Is there a strategy to using by writing a brief report or an article about them? Not sure I entirely uh, understand this, but I think what you're trying to say, Francesco, is or to ask is how to write stories about minorities which are usually portrayed in a negative way. I think that's what you're saying. Well, again, it goes back to what I was saying just now, I suppose, is that it's a question of trying to find some, more positive stories, more stories which show those minorities in, in a less biased way, in a less biased light. I don't think it's our job as journalists to go looking for positive stories, or at least trying to. It's not our job to. If the story is negative, then we shouldn't be trying to spin it in a positive way. So if there are problems with a particular minority and they are verifiable problems, then we should tell that. Um, however, I don't think there are ways of telling individual stories about people within communities which show them in a positive light, or which show them in a more empowered light, which could go against the trend of if there's a lot of negative stories. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't quite understand your question, but we can maybe take it offline. That's fine. So I'm going to, yes, oh yeah, I think that's a good point you make there. That Twitter and Facebook, like any tool, they have a positive and a negative side. And people have been complaining about declining in standards in journalism since ancient times. So this is nothing new. I think what is new is the speed at which these changes happen. But okay. Well, thank you all for listening. I hope it was useful to you. The For those who came in kind of halfway through, or even more than that, I'm really sorry. I'm not quite sure what happened there. But the whole recording will be online soon. The slides I've used are already online, so you can access those. And and if you have any individual questions, whether you're from my group or from Brent's group, then you're quite welcome to fire them to me by email. Okay, so thanks for your time. Enjoy the rest of the course, and we'll see each other for the next webinar, which I think is in a couple of weeks' time. And this time, I'll make sure that the correct time is posted. Okay, thanks a lot. Bye.